Welcome back to the Coffee and Podcast, where specialty coffee means so much more. We are on a quest to cultivate freedom for victims of human trafficking, all while drinking wicked awesome coffee. I'm your host, Philip Klayman. I'm also the co-founder of Three Tree Coffee in Statesboro, Georgia. We have been doing a three-part series where we learn more about where our coffee comes from. How does it get from the farm to our cup? And in this first part of the series last month, we had Harry Hutchins with Finca Terrorito on to tell us more about how does coffee get from the farm to the boat? What happens at the farm level that affects quality and pricing of coffee? And that was a great episode. So if you missed it, really encourage you to go back and check it out. Today, we move on to how does coffee travel across oceans? We're talking about boat to roast. What are the logistics of moving a lot of coffee at the same time? And I could not be more excited than to have Joey Stazzone on with Cafe Kreyol. Cafe Kreyol creates sustainable employment in the specialty coffee industry, and they have a special interest in Haiti, but they have a presence in many other countries as well. I'm super pumped to have Joey on the show today. So, Joey, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks for having me today, Phil. I appreciate it. Again, I'm Joey Stazzone, the owner of Cafe Kreyol and president. We are a direct trade coffee importing as well as roasting company that focuses on creating sustainable employment. We started out in Haiti, but we work in about a dozen countries total. Haiti continues to kind of be our flagship because we want to create as much employment there as possible. But like I said, we work in a number of other countries as well. Our company got Roaster of the Year 2023 from Roast Magazine, as well as a couple other awards. And we're just super grateful for what we've been able to do in the industry, for the recognition, for the good friends and partners we have, and for being here today.
Yeah, man, y'all have made so many strides in the specialty coffee industry, and I really don't want to undersell that for our listeners that y'all won Roaster of the Year in 2023, which is a very prestigious award. So, way to go on that. And we love what y'all are doing, not just in quality, but also in your ethical standards and the way you want to support people by what you're doing. I remember we first met Joey, I think it was in Atlanta at a coffee conference years and years ago. And I remember we were at this latte art competition and we just started chatting. And you're telling me about getting on a motorcycle in the middle of Haiti and driving through farms and all sorts of stuff. Wild stories. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about how did you get involved in specialty coffee?
Yeah, I did not intend to be starting a business at the time. So when I founded Cafe Creole, I had gone down to Haiti with my church on a missions trip. I believe this was in like 2011. And we spent a week down there with a group of 15 people or so. None of us spoke Haitian Creole. And we ended up painting walls for a week and sharing Bible stories through a translator that was a Christian and could have easily been doing similar stuff without us there. I felt like our collective 15 plus $1,000 was not well spent, and it could have been used to do something to better Haiti. Going there and painting walls and leaving with a country that's 65% unemployed didn't sit well with me. One of the things that impacted me the most was right before we left. A bunch of people from the US gave us duffel bags of shoes to bring to Haiti to give out. And they were all used shoes. Bring these with you, give them out when you're down there. And so we dumped them all out in a market where people were buying and selling things. And this woman that started crying nearby uh, happened to be selling shoes. And we spoke with her. And she said, "You know, I got a loan from my bank to buy shoes to sell in this specific market. You just gave everybody a free pair." She said, "You guys aren't helping as much as you think." And so we spent a bunch of money to take jobs away from people in Haiti, and that didn't sit well with me. I flew home, bought a ticket back to Haiti by myself, and went back to Haiti and got a motorcycle and started learning Haitian Creole and just going through the mountains and figuring out how I was going to employ people. And there showed, from seeing and researching that coffee was a huge export there at one point. Haiti was doing 85% of the world's consumption in the late 1700s. I know it's a long time ago, but that shows a lot of potential. And so we started to work with producers. I started to go around and find coffee growers who was already growing. And that's kind of how my company was born there in Haiti.
It's amazing how every action can have ripple effects. And sometimes we go into something intending to be helpful, but it ends up hurting because we weren't really looking at maybe the big picture or looking at it from every single approach. And it sounds like you have a very personal story with that. And I think it's really neat that you're saying, how can we make an economic impact, right? How can we look at it from that perspective and make an impact there? So tell us a little bit about how you started the business and what happened after in those first few years after you started the business.
Yeah, that was in 2012 that I flew back on my own. It was in early 2012. And I kind of just accumulated about 200 producers that I'd found in the mountains. I started coming back with coffee in suitcases, and I didn't know that I was starting a business. To be clear, that I wasn't like I'm starting a coffee business. I was like, these people could have employment somehow with this. I'm going to learn what it takes to get this coffee where it needs to be. So I came home and started roasting that coffee at a Whole Food store, actually. So I was a supervisor in a meat department at a Whole Food store, and I had a key and went in at night when I wasn't supposed to be there and was using their roaster to roast some of this coffee. And one of the managers caught me breaking into the store. And I was like, hey, look, look, no, I'm sorry. I know I'm not supposed to be in here, but check this out. I was just down in Haiti. There's these farmers, there's this coffee. I'm trying to see if we can help them at all. And I did lose my job, but he really liked the story and got me a meeting with regional. And so I kind of just put my next foot forward and went to a regional meeting. And I didn't have packaging yet or even coffee. Like I roasted a little bit of that to try, and I made a pour over at the meeting. And they were like, "Yeah, we like this. Tell us about it." And I was like, "It's grown by these Haitian farmers. We're creating jobs down there." I didn't even have packaging, and they just put in several purchase orders. So I suddenly had a business, and it started with this Haitian coffee. And so I started going back and forth to Haiti, working on coffee and processing with them. I went to Costa Rica and learned a significant amount about um, processing and fermentations there. That must have been about 12 years ago now, and spent a good chunk of time in Haiti, going to the Dominican Republic when I wanted to take rest, because Haiti is a challenging and exhausting place to spend a lot of time. So when I would go over to the Dominican, I would rest, and then I'd go back, and I started making some really solid friends over there. And that led to me starting to work with Dominican coffee as well. And kind of one thing after another, we began to expand this model to use as direct trade in another country in another origin, not necessarily doing the exact same thing. It depended on what was needed in the place at the time that we were working, and specific opportunities might have called us there or not. And it's not always the same, but we now work in about a dozen countries doing the same model. Honduras, Ethiopia. We partner with Long Miles Coffee Project out in Burundi. We work down in Colombia, Bolivia, El Salvador, obviously Dominican and Haiti.
So we've actually purchased one of your coffees before. It was from the Dominican Republic. It was a honey processed coffee and it was really good. But I love how your approach is to kind of take it by case scenario. You don't just say what's a one size fits all approach for everyone. You kind of look at each individual, each individual farm, all the individual farmers that you work with to say what do they need, and then how can we best serve them through what we're doing. And I think you have one coffee. Forgive me if I'm wrong, but I want to hear more about it. I think you have one coffee that's called cocaine to coffee or something like that, where these farmers were growing some sort of drug, but then that was transformed to coffee. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, no, you have it very close. It's similar. So it's called our Cocaine for Coffee project, and really the plant is not cocaine; it's coca, but we call it our Cocaine for Coffee project. And that started in Colombia through an initiative with a friend of mine, Santiago, who decided he was going to work with some families and torch some coca fields and get people to grow coffee. And those coca fields were directly selling into streams that would have been creating cocaine out of them. Now, we work in Bolivia as well with another project in the Apollo region. Apollo, Bolivia is an indigenous state that's up nestled in the corner by Peru. It's very far from like the rest of civilization. It takes, I think, 13, 14 hours of driving just to get to this town of Apollo. And then you're looking at 4 or 5 more hours, maybe, depending on which community you're going to from there. And all these communities have, it's quite amazing actually. There might be only 5 families in a community, or there might be 30 families, and that's the people who live here. And this is in Amazonia. That's where this area is. They call it Madidi, is the national park in Bolivia, but it's all part of Amazonia. And so I started partnering with Wildlife Conservation Society about 6 years ago because they're looking to protect Amazonia. And there's two things that are happening in that specific area, and that's gold mining from the Chinese, and that's demolishing everything to a really heavy degree, and coca. And coca requires full sunlight. So that means cutting down the entire forest. It really depletes the soil. It's sucking all the nutrients out, and with no other plant life, there's no nutrients going back into it. So it destroys the land, which makes it where the people cannot continue to farm. It's not a sustainable practice for long term. So transitioning people in that area now away from growing coca, we've been transitioning, specifically the community Trinidad has transitioned to coffee. And it's an 80% female community. We don't know why it's 80% female. This community is mostly, maybe they killed all their men off. That's how that's the proportions though in Trinidad. And these women have decided that they want to change over to coffee. We've done some tree cover and set this up for them 6 years ago with Wildlife Conservation Society, and they're doing fantastic. And their coffee is cupping good and has a really nice orange acidity to it that is really unique. You don't find it a lot of origins with this caramel sweetness that complements it well. Um, yeah, we're really proud of that initiative and that project.
Well, very neat. Let's go ahead and transition this conversation more to the boat to roast part of the podcast. But before we even get to the boat, I want to back up a little bit. On the last podcast, Harry Hutchins told us a little bit about the dry milling process, but I want us to come back to that because when I was getting into specialty coffee, I feel like I understood the wet milling process, which is kind of like your washed coffees, your natural coffees. But I didn't really understand what was happening at the dry mill until I actually went overseas and saw it for myself. And so, could you explain to our listeners what's happening at the dry mill? What sort of things do they do, and how can that affect the logistics and the shipping of coffee?
Yeah, there's quite a bit. It can depend on the origins. This is going to differ everywhere. I'd love to give you a few examples of things that I've seen and how directly in relation to how that can impact shipping and logistics. Okay. So the dry mill is going to need to take place to get the coffee stabilized, stored, and parchment removed. What that means is the green seed that is within the coffee fruit, there are two seeds typically, with the exception of a genetic defect called pea berry, where there's only one. There's two seeds within each coffee fruit, and those seeds are extracted, washed, dried. Possibly, if it's a washed coffee, that's the norm. And those dried seeds need to be dried to a humidity level of 10 to 12%. Usually around 11, 11.5 is spot on where we want it. Then that coffee needs to be stored in a place where it's not going to gain more moisture or lose more moisture. So when it is dried, to kind of back up to that drying, how do we get it to that humidity, right? Um, that coffee is going to be put on a patio or on a raised drying bed. Sun is directly hitting it. I can go into a lot of details about how we would slow or speed that up, but I'm just going to kind of leave it for now. And that coffee is basically dried on these to get it to that humidity level. It's put into storage. That storage keeps it at the right moisture level. And then there's a thin layer of paper that's called parchment or pergamino in Spanish. And that's removed right before the coffee ships. How does this relate to logistics? So there's origins that specifically put these in places, and most places would try to do this where it's as close as possible to where that product is going to ship from, um, or close to the farm so that it can get stabilized and taken care of, and then as close as possible in relation to that to where it can ship from, right? Um, in Bolivia, I was just there, for example, in August. It's very very different than that. We have, and this isn't the only place I run into this problem. Bolivia is landlocked, I already mentioned that Apollo is 14 to like 18 hours from the nearest city on very slow dirt roads. And when you harvest your coffee there and you dry it to the right moisture level, the right humidity level, and it's raining, for example, and you can store it somewhere, but you can't drive on the dirt roads in the rain through the mountains. How long is that coffee going to go without going to this dry mill? Does it need to be dried again? If it does that, you're now increasing the water activity, is what it's called, and that's going to lower the quality of the coffee. It also will cause it to age faster. There's a few different implications, none of which are positive. Um, it can absorb aromas that are in the air from water activity as well. Again, none of which are positive. So the lack of being able to move it sometimes to places is a big deal. When it finally can get to that dry mill, which uh, it could be 4 hours away. In Bolivia, sometimes it could be 12 hours away. And I mean, people will dry right there on their farms to get it to the closest amount possible, which is completely fine to get it to 15% and finish shipping it to a dry mill. That's not going to hurt your coffee as long as it doesn't keep fluctuating. And then it can get to this next place. What happens when that's so far away and you're just one family that produces 5 sacks of coffee a year, 20 sacks of coffee a year? So that's a challenge. And people can pool them together to move them to that dry mill. But what if those roads aren't all good because of rain? Um, Huge hurdles that can impact logistics with that. It's a lot to think about. But we think about a cup of coffee and it's good or it's bad, or, oh, why is this bad? Why is this? Or you can appreciate that it's good and understand how much actually went into those people having to coordinate and care for these seeds to get together around the same time and in whatever weather was possible, get it all the way in Bolivia to El Alto, which is above La Paz in a very dry, cool area where it's able to stay stabilized. That's one example of where it's very challenging to get all those things lined up.
Yeah. So you mentioned water, moisture. I just want to slow down a little bit because moisture is so important with coffee. I want to recap some of this. So water moisture is how much water is literally in the bean, and you're saying that you're looking for around 10 to 12% water moisture. And then there's something called water activity, which is how much water is either drawn into the bean or released from the bean, and the speed at which that can happen for specifically coffee. And so what you're saying is we got to keep the moisture in this bean so stable, even up to the dry mill, let alone once it leaves the dry mill. Otherwise, we're affecting flavor potential.
It could. And the storage in between the movement is you have to have. So the proper storage that we've seen that's really able to maintain the coffee is concrete floors with wood stacked on top of that, and then coffee stored in parchment on that. We've experimented a little bit with storing the parchment in Grain Pro. Grain Pro is a liner for burlap coffee sacks or jute coffee sacks that's plastic that'll go inside of it and can be sealed to lock in moisture. That's typical for sending green coffee when it's shipping out, green seeds, unroasted coffee seeds out when it ships. We've experimented with it in parchment, but I don't have conclusiveness. And I do find it differs based on too many variables at the moment to say whether that's a good idea to do for coffee that's in parchment, because I have seen a lot of negatives that have come with that as well.
It's fascinating to hear that there's just so much logistics that goes into moving coffee just to the dry mill. We haven't even gotten to the boat yet, just to make sure that it's moving with quality, that it's adding value to the people whose hands it's touching as this coffee is moving through these sort of logistical chains. And then the dry mill removes the parchment. Well, what else does the dry mill do?
Store and stabilize for sure. Uh, so, storing that coffee for 6 weeks to 8 weeks is called a reposo period. It's a resting period for the green coffee. You have to understand that this coffee seed has been through a lot. And Phil, you mentioned you've been to some coffee farms and seen the milling process before. There's so much happening to this poor little seed that was just created. It came out of nothing. There was a flower. That flower became a tiny green hard fruit. That fruit matured, became softer, sweeter, ripe, maybe red or yellow. And then it was picked. It's been depulped. It's been washed. It's been dried in the sun. Uh, the cells are extremely unstable within that seed. That allows for penetration when they're unstable. So things can come in and out easier. You want to stabilize them to hold what is in there in, right? And so that reposo period, we believe, is very important. We like to rest our coffees for about 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks at origin before it ships, almost everywhere. There's a few places we don't do that, and that's just because of extreme humidity where that would damage the product. But most of the time, we would go through that resting period, and that's something that would happen right there at the dry mill. Uh, a good dry mill will also have the ability to cup coffees, to do some testing to find out if specific lots have issues or need something to take a look at, or they're worth more, anything like that. So, a good dry mill will be also doing quality evaluations on the coffee. When that coffee is ready to be sold and the parchment, that paper substance, comes off of it through things rubbing on the outside of it, large machines that'll rub and just kind of take that paper off. Those seeds need to be sorted. And those seeds are sorted to remove basically visible defects. Those visible defects could be things like a full black seed, could be insect damage where you can see where a beetle has bored into it, a number of other things. And maybe a chipped bean, maybe a husk where it's just the shell of a seed. People are actually going to go through those and sort typically by hand. There's machines that do them. They're not nearly as accurate as humans, or usually when machines do it, humans still go through afterwards and do the final sorting to make sure that it's up to the grade of specialty. After all that work, it would be a shame not to be, right.
Gotcha. So, to help some of our listeners kind of understand parchment, I remember the first time I saw parchment on the coffee bean, it actually reminded me a little bit of, in a peanut on the inside, you've got kind of that papery substance that's covering the peanut. And you can kind of like almost rub it off with your finger. Well, parchment on coffee is kind of similar, maybe a little more brittle than the soft papery substance on a peanut. But nonetheless, that's kind of what it feels like, and you can kind of just scrub it off with your fingers. So now let's move on from the dry mill. What happens next? How does coffee get across oceans?
So this coffee, it's again going to depend on the origin. I can give you a couple examples here, but that coffee needs to be shipped out. So if it is a landlocked country, it's going to need to get to a port. I'm in Burundi right now. We have a team of people that's taking a container of our coffee to Dar es Salaam in Tanzania to ship out. So it's going to be crossing from one country into another and going to the port. And then from there, we have a booking where then those people have to connect with our company and our booking to get that coffee loaded onto a specific container. And these containers are 20 foot, 40 foot in size. There's 53 foot, I believe, and they can be hot, not frozen or frozen. You could get frozen containers as well. Coffee obviously does not need to be. Typically, it's shipped in 20 foot containers because if you go larger than that, it's over some weight limits when it's put onto a truck in the US anyway. So it doesn't have a ton of reason to be in a larger container. In that landlocked country, when it gets to Dar es Salaam, for example, in Tanzania, it's going to go on a shipping carrier. And there's, dozens of different ocean freight carriers that exist. We're in a very strange time right now where the Red Sea is shutting down. And so anything coming out of Eastern Africa, we're having a lot of issues. We're going to have to take it around the southern end of South Africa now and Cape Town and go right back up, take it over here.
The Red Sea shutting down, does that have to do with the Israeli Palestine conflict right now? Or are there other things that's causing that to be an issue?
So, from my understanding, it's actually rockets being fired from Yemen into onto commercial ships in the Red Sea, and I believe it is still related to what's going on in Israel Palestine. I think that they mentioned that it was something like that, but this is a completely different place where they are actually firing rockets at commercial ships. And so most commercial ships don't want to go through there anymore. I wouldn't want my cargo going through there.
Yeah, wow. When talking about the risks of coffee traveling over oceans, I was not expecting rocket fire to be a part of this conversation. That's pretty wild. Keep going.
Yeah, you should read Monk of Mokhtar, where he gets coffee out of Yemen on a boat while there's rockets blowing things up around him as well. I mean, and that isn't common, but does that happen? Yes. And is there insurance coverage for things that are on the water? I don't know. How good is your insurance at covering things when you ask them to? Because I haven't had great experience with that in the past. I think we all hope that our container is never going to be on a boat that sinks, right? That's just so out there that hopefully that would never be us. But there's other problems too. I had a container just arrived from Ethiopia that had a gigantic hole in the top. And I'm not kidding, just a giant hole in the shipping container. And it had been raining and it destroyed a bunch of sacks. And so we have to figure out what's going to happen with that now. But it wasn't like that when it left because there's pictures. So that means something got damaged with a container hitting another container. But these containers are on the water on giant boats with just thousands of shipping containers stacked up. And they make their way from port to another port where they unload and load, and another port where they unload and load, and they keep working their way until they get to your destination.
How much coffee are we talking about here when you say a container?
A container can fit 320 sacks of 60-kilogram sacks coffee. If the sacks are 70 kilos, it can fit 300, maybe 295, somewhere in that range.
And then how long does this journey usually take? I know it's going to vary depending on what country it comes from, but maybe give us kind of a minimum and a maximum of how long does it take?
1 week to 6 weeks, let's say. On the water, yeah, 6 weeks. 1 week to six is what I usually see. I guess it could be a tiny bit longer than that, but that's not common.
Yeah. So picking the containers, are you doing that? Are you looking at these containers on a website? Are you contracting someone else to do this? From our conversation earlier, you were talking about, moisture and how important the environment is that the bean is in. Well, clearly the container is important to make sure that the bean is in a good environment. So, how are you picking these containers? How's that decided?
It does matter that it doesn't have a giant hole in it, but generally speaking, if it's a metal container, a shipping container that's not, I this is the first time I've ever seen a giant hole in a shipping container like that. It should be okay. We do not send our shipping containers. That's something that you would have to be. I don't know how big of a company you'd have to be, but you'd have to be very big to be taking care of things like that. So the shipping company that you use has shipping containers, and you will use one of theirs, and it does get inspected before being filled up by whoever's loading it. Yeah. So that coffee will arrive to different ports, your container, whichever port you want to send it to, and there's a lot that has to happen when it arrives here. The time on the water, as long as that coffee's in Grain Pro bags, those sealed sacks, which we really try to use for anything, especially if we're expecting any risk or if it's a longer transit time. Most specialty coffees are traded in Grain Pro now. And this is the reason why. If there's a hole in that shipping container and it got water on 20 sacks of coffee, I only lost 20 sacks of coffee, which is already a lot. You know how much that costs. It's too much, right? But if that water had affected all other 300 sacks on that container because they weren't Grain Pro, that would have been a bigger issue. Grain Pro is a $4 liner that you can put inside of that jute, and it's that insurance that you're not going to have outside elements harming the quality of your coffee. So yeah, that's a key during that shipping process.
Yeah. So, what other risks can you see when it talks about shipping? When we're talking about shipping coffee, and it seems like most of it revolves around the container. I actually remember one time I was talking with someone. This was a while back in the specialty coffee industry, and they were ordering close to a container of coffee, which is a lot of coffee. And when they received it, it actually all tasted and smelled like fish, mainly just because of the container. And it's just wild to think how sensitive these beans are to taking on smells and tastes.
I've never had that happen. I have had other sensory things go wrong with coffee being on a container, but if you are having people inspect those containers, you should avoid things like a fish smell. That would be immediately picked out, and that does have to happen. You can inspect a container and have it be, removed for another one, especially when you say you're doing a food product. It's just that happens. And your producers, who are the ones selling the product, are typically the ones organizing the loading of that, or the dry mill, right? So when that's taking place, they want to ensure that their product is going to be safe. And so that inspection is done in order to avoid things like that. There are other risks. I'm going to give you a couple. I'm going to give you two, actually, both related to Haiti, because they're the first ones that come to my mind. One of them is before it leaves the port, but I want to mention that Port-au-Prince right now, for people who are not familiar with the news going on in Haiti, is a mess. It's been terrible for the last couple of years. And I don't mean like how everybody's always had this bad connotation about Haiti. I've had people telling me not to go to Haiti since the first time I went there. Haiti's dangerous. Don't go there. Blah, blah, blah. It'll never go anywhere. That's all not true. I've been going back and forth to Haiti by myself for a long time. I have very good friends there. It's a fantastic place and there is no trouble. But the last 2 years, these gangs have taken over Port au Prince. They've made it very dangerous for anybody coming in and out, for Haitians that live there, for any trade or commerce. And so it's a real threat at this point to also have coffee hijacked in Port au Prince. And so we're not moving anything through there at the moment. We're avoiding that because we can't afford to have $200,000 on a shipping container going through an area where there's chaos and anarchy and things could get stolen, right?
So, when you say you're trying to avoid that, are you coordinating with other ports to try and get the coffee where you need it?
Yes.
This is kind of a lame example, but this all kind of makes me think of Ticket to Ride. If anyone's ever played that game, it's like you're trying to get from point A to point B, but maybe someone takes a route that you were wanting to take. So you have to find a different route that is going around a longer way. It's not as convenient, but you don't really have any other options. Just fascinating to hear all this. So, what else you got?
Yeah, you're making the best with what you can and you have to make it work. There's a lot of problem solving, there's risks, and there's people's lives that are built on the shoulders of what you're doing. When I was 26 and I started this, and I still don't, I'm 38 now and I still, have to make decisions where I don't know, haven't had training on how to come up with the answer, but you have to make the best decision you can and do it with the best of your ability, because at this point you have several thousand people that might be riding on that. And that is, you're bearing the weight of all of that on it while you're trying to navigate huge problems internationally that you really have no business with. You haven't been business with people firing rockets in Yemen, or uh, gangs taking over Port-au-Prince, but you have to figure out what else can we do right now to avoid these people losing their money and getting paid, and continuing our sustainable project that is economically impacting this area in a positive way. Our My other example was actually when I first shipment out of Haiti. It was right after we had that deal with Whole Foods, and we started to get some traction up here. We ended up, I, Haiti is a tough place to find shipping out of. It's not a place where you can just go online to Maersk or Hamburg Sud or Hapag Lloyd or these other ocean freight companies and say, what do you have coming out of this port? Do you have anything coming out of Djibouti to go to Baltimore? Oh, you have Newark, New Jersey instead. Sure, we can make that work. There's things going into Haiti. People aren't shipping things out. And so I did find one company that was willing to do a pickup with some things there at the time. And this was back in 2012. And that coffee went to Jamaica afterwards. And there was a huge strike in Jamaica. And so all these shipping containers, right after ours was picked up and it was on the water, and this was before we started using Grain Pro, it was on a shipping container and it was sitting out there on the water. And a week went by, and 2 weeks went by, 3 weeks, and 4 weeks, and five. And we went all the way up to like 8 or 9 weeks where shipping containers were just backed up outside of Jamaica because there was this big strike. And a lot of people lost money because of this, because there's, buildings that were waiting on materials that were going up in Las Vegas and all these different trades happening. And our coffee happened to be on one of these containers. When it came, it tasted, you could taste burlap in the coffee because it was on a hot ocean in burlap. So some of the beans were touching that burlap, and coffee is like a sponge. It absorbs what's around it. It absorbs smell. Um, it absorbs all of the taste. And so we could taste that burlap, and we sent it to some Q graders to taste as well. I was not a licensed grader at the time. I just started out. This was my first year doing coffee. She told me, without knowing any of the details, she said, it tastes like metal, like a metallic taste. Do you know if this coffee was on a shipping container for a very long time? Which is when I was like, I need to learn how to taste like this. And She became a mentor for me and helped me to learn a lot more after that. But I was impressed that she could actually taste metal, and it was on a shipping container for a long time. And she picked that right out. We have come a long way since there, but those are risks that could happen anytime.
Wow. So this directly impacts flavor, but you said something that I think is so important. This also affects people too. I think it's so easy to get caught up in just the product itself, and we forget about the people all along the way that played a role in creating that product. It's easy as a business owner and as a consumer to kind of overlook that. So I just think that's a really profound and powerful statement you made, is that there's people behind this, and we need to keep that in mind. So give me an example of how often, how often does this go down exactly the way you want? I mean, we're hearing about rocket fire, labor strikes, holes in containers with tons of water pouring in. Does that happen all the time, most of the time? Is that just some of the few exceptions? How often is this sort of thing happening?
Some of the problems are smaller than others. I'll count those two as problems though. Okay. Do you want a smooth container? Something that just came in and we had no trouble? We're not a big company. We do about 20 containers a year of coffee. I would say 4 to 7 of those have no problems. 4 to 7. Four. Well, I'm leaning more towards, yeah, I'm leaning more towards like 4 or 5.
So out of 20 containers, about four don't have any problems. So like 20, 25% or something like that. Wow.
That's right. Those are celebratory moments.
Yeah, absolutely. When you have so much potential for problems, I'm sure when a container comes in perfectly, it's a celebration, right? I'm sure it's a joy. So much risk in the environment. Can you think of other risks when it comes from getting coffee from point A to point B?
One thing that people don't know, consumers don't know, even roasters don't know, and I think our country needs to be aware of, is United States Customs. Um, they go into containers and they decide if they want to search it. First of all, you have to pay for your container to get searched. So if they decide they want to X-ray your container, that's $450 for you to have your own container X-rayed. During that time,
Hold on, hold on. So you're saying that when a container gets here, US Customs can just say, hold on, we want to inspect it and you have to pay for it.
they flag them. And their rules are extremely inconsistent, and they will argue that they're consistent every time. And I'll say, but you didn't do this here. And they say, we always do this. And um, it could get held up for several weeks after that. And I want you to know that when that container is held up, there's a rent fee that has to be paid. to the port for the container sitting there, and US Customs doesn't rush, even you could be paying $80 a day or you could be paying $300 a day. And if you imagine that for a few weeks, that's significant. You could be adding, it's significant. Um, that rent fee matters. That's added to the $450. Then, if they decide after the x-ray they'd like to search your container, they will open it, they'll cut the seal open, and they take knives and just slash open coffee sacks. It goes all over the place. They drag them out sometimes while it's raining into the rain so they can just slash a few open, pull out your coffee, throw it all over the place. They throw it back on. Sometimes they miss a couple sacks when they're throwing it back on. So you might lose $2,000 of stuff that's just sitting there. And they charge you for that search where they cut stuff open another $2,000. So you paid $450, you paid $2,000. You're paying for all those days. You're paying for that missing product. Your bill for custom searching you could end up being another, I don't know, 2,000, 5,000. I've seen them be as high as $7,000, $8,000 when that coffee comes in. As a small business owner, that's an enormous hit. We've sent letters to customs before, and the message we got back was, and I sent pictures of what they did with the tape on it that says US Customs and how they slashed it open and said, hey guys, I know you have to search things, totally respect that. If there's a way you could do that without completely destroying small businesses' products, we'd appreciate it. That'd be amazing if you could do that. They said, we didn't do this, but if we did, here's an article of US law that says we're not liable.
Wow. So is this like common? Does this happen a lot?
I would say out of the 20 containers a year, that probably happens on a good year only once. That could happen up to 4 times, maybe, if you're really unlucky.
Yeah, I'm sure that's a massive hit. And you mentioned lots of ways that that lost value for you, but then there's also just the delay in sales. If you don't have the product to roast, you may not be able to fulfill orders. So there's possible lost value there as well. Ooh, okay. So let's kind of hang on the government theme for a minute. How involved are governments in this process, kind of from country to country? You mentioned US Customs, but is the government heavily involved in some of these other countries as well?
There are some coffee producing countries where the government is heavily involved. Most it is not. Some examples where it's heavily involved would be obviously like Ethiopia, where they actually set coffee prices. They have rules about exporting seeds that could be germinated because they want their varietals, their strains to stay right there in Ethiopia. All of that's regulated. The price every year, whether it's grade 1 or 2, has to be government approved. They even have rules that make things a little bit difficult with people working in Ethiopia. Like you, up until last year, you had to use an exporter, and these exporters didn't want to allow transparency of pricing to what the producers are making. So that's obviously a big problem for certain companies like us, where our intention is to make sure that everybody in the supply chain is taken care of, not just the producer. We want to make sure they are one of the most vulnerable. We want to make sure the supply chain is all essential people that are providing good work and all taken care of. And with the exporter not allowing anything to be seen behind that, it's a big issue. Last year, when you started allowing, Ethiopia finally started to allow that, they have these other weird rules, like you have to have different paperwork for all 5 producers putting something on this container, which means we have to do customs 5 times for it back here. So you have 5 times as much work and cost. And customs is going to cost you about, you have to buy a bond, which is $1,000 to import something, but you're talking about $500 to $600 for taxes and importing documents and FDA, every piece of paperwork. So ideally, that would only be one because you could put them all in the same paperwork, but Ethiopia doesn't allow that. So it causes 4 times the cost. That's one example. Is their country? Kenya has heavy regulations with their coffee as well. And then you have some countries that are not, where countries are not involved, their government, with the production. We try to avoid that entity at all costs so that they don't get in our way or try to do anything that's going to cause more work, less pay for producers, anything like that.
So this has been incredibly eye opening. And we're just going to end with one more question. As you look ahead into the future of specialty coffee, what sort of challenges or opportunities do you see when it comes to the logistics side of shipping coffee, of getting coffee from boat to roast?
It's a good question. You know, Phil, I wouldn't have said war a week ago to be a problem, but it is one. So I really don't know. Like we just struggle with something where it's like, hey, because of this war, we now can't get shipping containers through here. The world's a crazy place with a lot of things. I have no intention of bringing up anything political on a podcast. I lean conservative, but I will say America is one of the only countries that does deny climate change. The rest of the world seems to all see it, understand it, especially in coffee producing places. It's not a political thing everywhere else in the world. Um, I do see that as being an issue because it is causing significant problems for moving coffee. For example, when rain doesn't stop for 3 months in a time of year when it never rained before in a country where you have to transport coffee and have it be stable, that's a big problem that needs to be overcome. I don't know how we're going to do that. When rain doesn't come for months in a place, in a time of year when it always comes because you need it for harvest, you need it so that the cherries grow. What do we do? Should we start building irrigation? I think that is our biggest challenge ahead of us as far as production and logistics are going to go right now that I can see. But there's so many unseen things. Like I said, I didn't know that a week ago missiles firing at containers in the Red Sea was going to slow down shipments out of Burundi, Ethiopia, anything in East Africa. So we this is the world we live in right now.
It is a wild world indeed. As you said, Joey, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. Really enjoyed having you on and just sharing more of your wisdom. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Phil.
Awesome. Well, what an eye opening conversation today. We think maybe coordinating an employee gathering or a community event is hard, let alone going through all these things that we talked about: government strikes, war, wild. Anyways, thank you to everyone who's been listening. Thank you so much. If you've been listening to this podcast for a while, if you could please do me a favor, please subscribe to this podcast. That just really helps us get the word out there. You'll see a subscribe button or maybe a download or follow button somewhere on your screen. I would really appreciate that. Just helps us get the word out about this podcast. And I really appreciate it. Thank you all so much for listening. And thank you for helping us cultivate freedom.